So we can get this off and rolling. So just a reminder that the Smithsonian project is live. If you want to try getting downtown at some point and checking it out. Please remember that both the metro system and the Smithsonian themselves require masks. So we're all used to that these days, but just in case. So on Friday, we started our look at Sauropodomorpha, the long-necked plant eaters, and we saw their origin among small-bodied, obligate omnivores, and then they evolved into somewhat larger, obligate, bipedal herbivores. And from that, we saw a transition to quadrupedality, and we saw the base of Sauropoda, to look at the early radiation of Sauropoda in the Triassic and early Jurassic. And I ended with some of the adaptations that characterize this group, Eusauropoda, the true or good sauropods. So we're going to pick up there. So this is the recently discovered oldest known Eusauropod, Bagualia, from Argentina, from the late part of the early Jurassic, actually. And it's actually pretty well dated. I mean, here are, this is a stratigraphic column, so a representation of the rocks in which it was found. It happened to have been in an environment where there was some volcanism going on. So we have ash beds above and below the layer with the fossil in. That could be radiometrically dated. And so the age of that's pretty well constrained. And we could see at this particular set of formations, one stacked on top of each other, sort of the sequence from prosauropod grade forms to this early Eusauropod, and not long after, look at these dates, so this, within the same million years, more specialized Eusauropods. And we see also around the same time a transition of plants, so a new phase of tree evolution. About the same time, the Eusauropods become a lot more common. And in the paper where this was described, so here we see the phylogeny, and this is one where time is tipped on its side, so older to younger. And so here we see sort of the basal parts of Sauropoda as compared to the Eusauropods. And this sort of tan area here represents a phase of a lot of volcanism and consequently a change in some of the global vegetation. So we saw an earlier case where there was a change in global vegetation related to the Carnian pluvial event and how sauropodomorphs took advantage of that. And the suggestion here is that a new phase of vegetation, which is responding to global climate change at this point, favored the rise and dominance of Eusauropods. And so here's a restoration of Bagualia, and with the volcanism in the background, just a little more impressive. All right, so here's some examples of some of the primitive Eusauropods from the Jurassic. So here's Cetiosaurus. Cetiosaurus, whale lizard, literally is the name, was actually known to Richard Owen. He does discuss Cetiosaurus in his British Fossil Reptiles, but there's so limited information at the time. It was mostly vertebrate. He didn't recognize it was a dinosaur when he was naming Dinosauria. He thought it was a large marine reptile, a giant seagoing croc. Subsequently, though, he would learn that it was a sort of dinosaur. So that's an example of one. Here's Jobaria, known from a very complete skeleton from northern Africa, from Niger. Some of the dinosaurs in this part of the tree are gigantic. Dicraeosaurus here and its kin include the largest dinosaurs known in the history of Europe. And there are some taxa at this part of the tree which may or may not form a clade, and it's an area of contention, that start adding extra cervical vertebrae. So they add extra neck bones. This would be evolved convergently in some other advanced sauropod groups. And this gives them incredibly long necks. In fact, there are specimens of Mamenchisaurus that are the longest necks known in Earth history. And it's conceivable that these forms, here's an example of one such, they include some extremely large dinosaurs, and the extra neck vertebrae almost assuredly help them feed extremely high up into the trees, as shown here. Some of the primitive sauropods, including primitive Eusauropods, may or may not, it's not entirely certain, seem to have a club tail, so it's convergent with the ankylosaurs, but it didn't last long. They're sort of limited to the Middle Jurassic and early Late Jurassic, and we don't see later forms with that, although as we will see, some later forms certainly did use the tail, at least on occasion, as a weapon. So we now are moving from the more primitive branches of Sauropoda to a clade called the Neosauropoda, the new sauropods. And this is the group that dominates the Middle Jurassic to the end of the Cretaceous. And you can see a distribution of these groups through time. And I'll also point out they split nicely, probably, into two clades. This clade here and this bigger clade over here. So this is a cladogram for Neosauropods. It's on the lecture notes, so you can check it out. Then you can see images of them. So the Neosauropoda, a diverse group of advanced sauropods. These were major parts of the ecosystem from the late Jurassic. The group appears in the Middle Jurassic, but at that time they're not as dominant as it would be in the late Jurassic. So late Jurassic all the way to the end of the Cretaceous. And this includes most of the truly gigantic sauropods. I mentioned some of the Dicraeosaurids were pretty big that I just talked about. Some of the Rebbachisaurids were really big. But most of the giants are in Neosauropoda. That said, there are some that reverse the pattern and are actually quite small. So this is one of the best known Neosauropods, Diplodocus. And in fact, when you go to the Smithsonian, you will see the sauropods you will see are both Neosauropods. The ones based on the more complete skeletons, and then the additional specimen is also from another Neosauropod. So Neosauropods include some of the most famous dinosaurs of all. So Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus are examples of Neosauropods, as are Brachiosaurus and its close cousin Titanosaurus, close cousin Giraffatitan, which are among the more popular and well-known dinosaurs. Neosauropods, as I mentioned, tend to be gigantic, and they're so awe-inspiring that they force paleontologists to lie down next to their individual bones. It's a way of showing how big they are. So this is an individual cervical, one neck bone that these guys are lying next to. They're both sauropod workers, both a little taller than me, to give you a sense of scale. Here is a drawing showing some of these giant sauropods. There is a 5'4" woman there for scale. Here's a blue whale, still larger than the largest dinosaurs, at least in terms of mass, if not length. And down in the corner, the artist is having a little fun. He put King Kong in there. So you can see, Tyrannosaurus, one of the largest theropod dinosaurs. We'll get to Tyrannosaurus itself on Friday. Shantungosaurus, one of the largest ornithischians. Here's a big Triceratops. So big ornithischians, big theropods, dwarfed by the sauropods, and specifically the Neosauropods. And just another way of showing that. So here's a batch of the giant, some of the largest sauropods known, and only the one in gray is probably not a Neosauropod. The rest of them are all Neosauropods. And occasionally, you've got skeletons on display. None of the giants are known from super complete material. Some are known from relatively complete material, but it gives you a sense, they sort of fill out the blanks on how big some of these creatures are. Here's Giraffatitan on display in Berlin. Pitagatitan, a specimen of this is on display at the Field Museum. Another is on display, a cast is on display in, it's cast in the Field Museum, it's also cast in New York City at the American Museum, if you want to see it there. Here's a sauropod worker lying next to one of the femora, the femurs of Pitagatitan. So yeah, gigantic animals. And even at sort of a basic glance here at these Neosauropods, I think you can get the sense that there are two major clades with slightly different body plans. And here they are. A clade called Diplodocoidea, so literally the super family of Diplodocus, but the Diplodocoids up there, and the Macronarians down below. So I'll first talk about what makes a Neosauropod a Neosauropod, and then we'll start looking at the distinction between Diplodocoids and some of their subgroups, and the Macronarians and their subgroups. So, Neosauropods in general tend to have the teeth more concentrated at the front end of the snout. The teeth don't go as far back in the jaw. Also, they've switched the form of occlusion. So remember, in Eusauropods, we began to get tooth-to-tooth occlusion rather than the wraparound overbite. So the teeth were meeting each other, but they were meeting each other in that zigzag pattern, so that each tooth below contacts two teeth above, and each tooth above contacts two teeth below. In Neosauropods, they sort of phase shifted over, so it's a one-to-one contact. Also, the nares, so the openings for the nasal passage, are more dorsally placed than earlier sauropods, although even in earlier sauropods, they're somewhat back on the head. So, just to give you an orientation on these openings, in Camarasaurus here, that's the orbit, so that's where the eye would go. That's the antorbital fenestra. That's the lateral temporal fenestra. That's the nares. So it's moved upwards and backwards. Over here, there's the orbit, the antorbital fenestra, and the nares you can't even clearly see. You might see a little bit of tan there. That's the sediment inside the skull. The nares is way on top of the head in this dinosaur. So, some of the traits that make Diplodocoids, as Diplodocus is indeed one, are pencil-shaped, or you might want to think crayon-shaped teeth at the front of the snout. So they're cylindrical teeth rather than spoon-shaped teeth. And for Macronaria, and we'll get some more traits for each of these, the nares is larger than the orbit, and in fact that's what the name means, is big nares, Macronaria. So compare the size of the orbit to the nares there. All right. Oh, also, in terms of the teeth, the early branches of Macronaria are similar to other Eusauropods. The teeth are sort of stout and spoon-shaped, spatulate, some people call them. However, there will be specialized Macronarians that actually evolved teeth that look a lot like Diplodocoids. So, Neosauropods include almost all the sauropods for which we have really good material. Some of the earlier ones we have some good material, but by and large, if you've got a good skull or skeleton of a sauropod, it's almost always from a Neosauropod. So these are all forms that are from the same general time and place, the Morrison Formation of Western North America, late Jurassic of Western North America, a couple specimens of Diplodocus, and another Diplodocoid Apatosaurus, as well as Camarasaurus. And here's the teeth of Camarasaurus with its big, stout, spatulate teeth. And its nice wear facets at the end where the teeth are contacting the teeth above or below. So we'll talk about Diplodocoids first in detail. So here's an example of, first of all, there's the top of the skull on Diplodocus. And what do we see? So we're seeing the antorbital fenestrae. The orbits we see a hint of, those are the nares. And not only are the nares moved way up on the head, but in most of these forms, they're actually conjoined. The opening from the left and the opening to the right form one single big opening. Some of the earlier forms, or some of the more basally branching forms, although they occur later, still have a partition, a separation. But in most cases, they're joined with each other. Also, this is an example of an isolated tooth, this pencil-shaped tooth. And you can see how they're all lined up right at the front of the snout. Now, those nares on the top of the head used to have people thinking that the nostrils were on top of the head. I talked a little bit about that last time. People even considered the possibility that these guys were snorkeling, that they were sticking their heads up from deep in the water and just putting the tops of their nostrils out to breathe like a blowhole. But the mechanics on that doesn't work, and it turns out the anatomical details show that their nostrils, the fleshy openings, are probably not on the top of the head, but rather at the front end of the snout. There are openings on the front end of the snout associated with the blood vessels and nerves for the fleshy nostril. They're not way up here, they're down here. And it also makes a little bit more sense if you had your nostrils way on the top of your head and you're trying to sniff something before you eat it, you would have to go like, and that's a little waste of time. Whereas if you've got your nostrils towards the front end of your snout, that's much more sensible. And it's true that most animals today that have nostrils on the top of their head, that have nares on the top of their head, actually have their nostrils on the front end. Although in the case of mammals, when they have nares on the top of their head, their nostrils tend to go far beyond the skull. That is, they have a trunk. No indication that any sauropod has a trunk, especially because the trunk muscles that we see in elephants and elephant seals and tapirs and so forth, those facial muscles, we have no evidence that dinosaurs had them. The equivalent muscles, the homologous muscles to the mammalian facial muscles are neck muscles, are throat muscles associated with the tongue in reptiles and sauropsids. So it would seem unlikely. They didn't seem to have the equipment to produce a true trunk. Let's see. Okay, now when I was talking about those pencil-shaped teeth, or as it says here, peg-shaped teeth, I was actually talking about adult Diplodocoids. The recent discovery of babies in Diplodocoids show that young ones have teeth which are a little more similar to what we see in something like Camarasaurus or more primitive Eusauropods, sort of spatulate teeth. And as they get older, they get these long, pencil, narrow type teeth. So they show an ontogenetic change, a change during development. And since the teeth are the way an animal interacts with its food source, it suggests that the way they fed changed as they got older. So baby Diplodocoids, this young one in the middle there, probably fed like Macronarians and other Eusauropods by sort of chomping off big chunks of plants. Whereas the adults, with that long row of teeth up at front, probably fed more by raking and scraping, so biting down, and either maybe pulling leaves off of branches and stripping it, or occasionally going after ground vegetation. We'll see one group that's adapted to that in particular, and just chomping up a whole bunch at once, or raking it along and scraping. So here we have a dorsal view of the skull of a bunch of Diplodocoids. So this represents one clade, Diplodocids. Here's a Dicraeosaurid. Here's a group called the Rebbachisaurids, which are the earliest branching, although they survived the latest, and a couple ones whose position actually kind of goes back and forth in different phylogenies. And we can see in the case of Nigersaurus, this highly transformed skull, and also this is one of the groups where the nares aren't quite conjoined. There's still a little bit of separation between them. But we can see that these guys are broad-snouted animals, and this suggests that they were essentially grazing, if you will. They weren't super picky in the sense of having really narrow snouts. So the Rebbachisaurids, this first branch, show up in the late Jurassic. They survive later than the other Diplodocoids. They die out early in the late Cretaceous. And they represent our third case of a dental battery. So we saw dental batteries show up in Hadrosaurids to help grind and shred their food. We saw the dental battery of Ceratopsids for slicing. And now we have a form of dental battery that goes mediolaterally. It's not forward and backwards, it's in the front row. We see that actually other sauropods are on their way to developing something like this, but the Rebbachisaurids actually get that. I'll show a close-up of it in a bit. Now, Rebbachisaurids are relatively short-necked as far as sauropods go. Basically, their necks are long enough to reach down to the ground, but not much longer than that. And they are typically relatively small-sized for a sauropod. only the size of an Indian elephant to maybe a little bigger than an African elephant. That's small for a sauropod. And these guys are built with their snouts facing downwards. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a bit. And indeed, a lot of their adaptations collectively show that these are not high browsers. These are not adapted for going up in trees, the ancestral sauropod way. These guys have now become grazers. They're feeding low to the ground. So Nigersaurus is the best known Rebbachisaurus, known from the best material. When the isolated skull bones were found, they were truly puzzling the paleontologists because they weren't in articulation, they had separated. And they were trying to get those tooth rows to be a little bit anteroposteriorly oriented, but no, they're entirely just along that front edge. So you can see it, and they're functionally like one row on each side, with a bunch of other teeth coming in below. So they have what we call a gnawing dental battery. Not really gnawing in the case of like a rodent, but somewhat functionally like that. So like that. With new teeth behind it to support these things. Now, what were they gnawing? Wasn't probably super tough vegetation per se, like a rodent would, but vegetation that's close to the ground gets a lot of grit in it, just kicked up from the soil. And so you have to be able to accommodate that fact or you're eating, because otherwise your teeth get worn down too quickly. So that's probably what favored the rapid growth of teeth in these forms. And these guys may have had the fastest replaced teeth of any dinosaur. So what were they eating? Well, they weren't actually grazing grass. Grass hasn't evolved yet. The very last Rebbachisaurids may have overlapped with the very oldest grass. But there's other low-lying vegetation, like horsetails and other ferns, which can often be sort of tough. And so this adaptation is probably for that. Now, when I said that their face was downward pointing, how could we possibly know that? Well, inside our skulls, inside the skulls of vertebrates, are basically spirit levels, like you would use if you're hanging a picture and you're trying to see if the picture is even. It's a set of 3 canals with fluid in it and a set of sensory cilia that can detect the motion of that fluid. These 3 canals are oriented at 90 degrees from each other. So there's one set that goes like this, one set that goes like this, and one set that goes that way. Well, the one that goes horizontally gives us a sense of what the natural horizontal position of that canal is. So we can position, these canals are actually surrounded by bone. It's one of the best preserved parts of that part of the brain region. So we can put the horizontal canal horizontal in these animals, and we see that in, a early Sauropodomorpha, it's facing essentially forward. In other Neosauropods, there's a bit of a dip downward, so the head's naturally somewhat tilting downward. In a Rebbachisaurid, the normal position is the face to be sticking pretty much straight downward. So that's the normal way. It's just walking around like this and munch. They also have actually quite large eyes, which makes some sense. They're not, unlike their cousins, able to look around that much because their head's not held high most of the time. So having bigger eyes gives them a chance of seeing an oncoming predator. Not all Rebbachisaurs are Nigersaurus, just to show there are a few other. This is the name bearer for the group, Rebbachisaurus. Sadly, not too much of it is known, but it shows it has extremely tall neural spines. It may have actually functionally had a sail. Now, I showed you Uranosaurus when I talked about ornithopods, which is another mid-Cretaceous North African dinosaur with a big sail down his body. In that case, it was an ornithopod, a Sauropodomorpha. Rebbachisaurus lived around the same time and place, had a similar thing, and on Wednesday, we will see a theropod dinosaur that lived with these things that had a really tall sail. Why? We'll talk about it later. But it's interesting that they overlap in time and place. Okay, another batch of Diplodocoids, the Dicraeosaurids. These show up in the Middle Jurassic. They peter out in the early Cretaceous. They're known mostly from South America and Africa, although there's a few from the late Jurassic in North America. Some of those skulls I showed, one of those skulls I showed is probably a Dicraeosaurid. The vast majority of these are small-sized animals. That said, there's a fragmentary specimen. It's so fragmentary, the specimen has been lost, but it was illustrated. That may, in fact, be a Dicraeosaurid and the largest sauropod, or one of the largest sauropods. So it's a group of small sauropods, except maybe they include the largest sauropod. People are hoping to find more of that once discovered, but since lost specimen. So, like the Rebbachisaurus itself, these guys have elongated neural spines, but unlike Rebbachisaurus, these spines are split down the middle. This is a trait they share with their cousins, the Diplodocids. And as you see, they have relatively short necks, so we don't have the front end of the neck here. But unless those really changed shape, Brachiosaurids here could only reach the ground with its neck. It couldn't reach very high. Similarly, Dicraeosaurus itself. Here's Amargasaurus, where those neural spines are even longer. And we can see B and C represent Dicraeosaurids, and A is Diplodocus. So typical Dicraeosaurids are small-bodied, or sauropod. Recently discovered, a couple years ago, is Bajadasaurus, with super long neural spines. Sadly, we don't have much of the animal, but assuming those neural spines continued throughout the neck, as they do in other tall-spined Dicraeosaurids, it looks pretty impressive. Additionally, the texture of the top end, the dorsal ends of the neural spines, suggests that they were covered in keratin. So they weren't just covered in skin, like some people once thought, or a web of skin, like people considered, but rather were kinds of spikes that were sticking out beyond the rest of the flesh, and so maybe functionally something like a porcupine, so as a defensive structure. And so here is an illustration of one of these guys, or a couple of these guys. Now, Diplodocids are among the best known and best studied of the Diplodocoids. They're the one who gave the name to the whole group. Diplodocus itself, the name bearer for the group, is one of the best known dinosaurs, period, but there's several other really well-known Diplodocids. They're a group from the late Jurassic to the early Cretaceous. They didn't last long, but they were impressive when they were around. Some of them are tremendously huge animals. And this group is characterized by a long whip-like tail. Whip-like tails might be present in Dicraeosaurids, we just don't have enough complete material of Dicraeosaurid tails to tell. One thing we do know, you can't tell from these specimens, but plenty of others will show them, is that this group, the forelimbs are very much shorter than the hind limbs, which is going to suggest something about some of their behaviors, as you will see. So Diplodocids. So that long whip-like tail, which really, when you look at the Diplodocus at the Smithsonian, you'll see it. What's that for? Well, it probably is to be long and whip-like. Modern long-tailed lizards, like iguanas, monitor lizards, and so forth, will use their tail defensively. If they're threatened, they will smack at the attacker to dissuade them. Now, we've got animals here with muscles bigger than cars whipping these tails, which might be a really good incentive to dissuade a predator from attacking them. And indeed, there is a specimen of Allosaurus, which is from the same time and place as Diplodocids, that has a damaged lower jaw, a damaged scapula, and a series of damaged ribs, actually I should show this side, that all line up. And that's not the sort of damage that a Stegosaurus thagomizer could do. The thagomizer would be two piercings on one side. This is a long, continuous stretch, almost certainly due to an encounter with an angry Diplodocid. So, the shorter forelimbs and extremely long hind limbs puts the center of mass right above the hips on these guys. And it's been suggested since the 19th century that perhaps these things could increase their feeding envelope by rearing up on their hind legs. Now, they couldn't walk in this position. Almost certainly, they could just rear up and then feed like a tall crane and then go back down. And it's worth noting, we find a lot of specimens of Diplodocids with fused cervicals at about this spot. At about the spot you would expect it to contact the ground. So that may have been a response to the pressures put on the tail there. So just to give you a sense of some of the variety of Diplodocids, especially ones that live like right next to each other. Same general time and place. So Diplodocus we'll use as sort of the standard four-door sedan model. It's common, it's long, but it's rather generic. It got huge. There were some specimens that were called Seismosaurus when they were discovered, and subsequently turned out to be just one species within Diplodocus proper. This is the specimen, based on the specimen that was called Seismosaurus, but it's just Diplodocus. In fact, the species that you'll see on display at the Smithsonian, which is this individual, is Seismosaurus, properly Diplodocus halorum. And in fact, we didn't know that we had known about Seismosaurus for 100 years before Seismosaurus was named. Then there's the stretch limo. Barosaurus is a stretch limo version. It's like Diplodocus and only stretched even longer. Kind of hard to believe, but it is incredibly long. Supersaurus has very similar proportions to Barosaurus, so another stretch limo. And then there are the SUVs, the heavily built ones. Brontosaurus and its cousin Apatosaurus. The limb bones themselves are more massive. The neck is much thicker and heavily reinforced. This may have been, some people suggested this more heavy build might have been that these guys pushed trees over in order to feed them. Well, maybe. There certainly are, elephants will push trees over on occasion to feed on them. And here we see one rearing up to push, maybe not push a tree down, but rearing up to eat some plants. And if those little mammals don't watch out, it will wind up on the menu. This shows the old style thought with the nostrils there rather than down here. But it's also been suggested by some sauropod workers that given the reinforced neck bones in this subgroup called the Apatosaurians, maybe they were adapted for smashing the necks into each other. We know things like giraffes today will do within-species combat by smashing their necks into each other in displays of strength. So perhaps sauropods did this as well. And so here we see some apatosaurs smashing into each other with their necks. It's an interesting hypothesis. It hasn't really been tested biomechanically yet, but it's a thought. Okay, so that's it for Diplodocoids. Now the other major branch, Macronaria. They also first show up in the Middle Jurassic, but this group is the one that survives to the end of the Cretaceous. The Diplodocoids die out in the early part of the late Cretaceous with the last Rebbachisaurids. So many of these retain, as I mentioned before, the broad spoon-shaped teeth. The nearest, as I mentioned before, is enlarged. It's as big or bigger than the organs. And typically, the longest metacarpal, so the longest long bone of the hand, is almost half the length of the radius, and it can be longer than it. It can be more than half the length of the radius. So these have sort of long hands. Camarasaurus is our best glimpse of an early Macronarian or a basal Macronarian. In fact, it's so basal, it may eventually wind up not being a Neosauropod. Some phylogenies have put it there. But it's certainly close to what a basal Macronarian looks like. The specimen, the skeleton there is not an adult. It's a very young individual, actually. And it's one of our best young sauropods. Now, although Macronarians include truly gigantic forms, they also include some of the smallest adult sauropods. And curiously, the tiny sauropods live on islands. So here, for instance, is Europasaurus. Europasaurus is from the late Jurassic, lived on islands in what is now Germany. And just as happens in the Cenozoic era, to mammoths and other elephants that got isolated in islands. Natural selection favors smaller and smaller individuals, because if you were really big and lived on an island, you're going to starve because you're not going to get enough vegetation, so the smaller individuals do better. And so it's basically a dwarf sauropod. That's an adult. And, it's got horse-sized. This occurs independently among some of the derived Macronarians, some of the Titanosaurs in the late part of the Cretaceous on the island of Transylvania. But in contrast, many Macronarians are gigantic. So we see three big ones here: Giraffatitan, Brachiosaurus, Sauroposeidon, compared to a modern giraffe and a human being. And indeed, Giraffatitan and Brachiosaurus, and possibly Europasaurus, are all members of a group called Brachiosauridae. And with the exception of Europasaurus, most of these are extremely giant animals. They have quite long necks. These are another group that adds some more cervicals. And those cervicals tend to be stretched out. The forelimbs are slender, and they're quite long, as long or longer than the hind limbs, which is weird for a dinosaur. So, more than any other sauropod, the brachiosaurids are built uphill. So that's how they're feeding high in the trees. They keep on going. These guys show up in the Middle Jurassic, and they die out in the early Cretaceous. And we tend to think of sauropods having small heads, and proportionate to the body, they are small. But this, as projected, is about the size of the head of Giraffatitan. So it's a good-sized head. It's just compared to the rest of the animal, it's tiny. Also, this is... I think I'll have a picture of that coming up. This is the animal that sneezes on the little girl in the first Jurassic Park movie, only they had the nostril in the wrong spot, but it was the right spot at the time, so it's justifiable. Here we see Brachiosaurus, as well as a Diplodocid from its environment, and dwarfed in between one of the theropods or two of the theropods from the environment. So here's an early Cretaceous Brachiosaurid, Cedarosaurus. Here we go. So here's the skull of Giraffatitan. All the letters here represent spots that had been hypothesized to be where the nostril, the fleshy opening, was. The current evidence is that it's A. So the air would come up through the throat, through the skull, out through the nares, inside fleshy tissue on the outside, and then the opening would be over here, and then back again. And so in the first Jurassic Park movie, they have it sneezing from about D, but in fact it would have sneezed out of A. And here we see a more modern representation of that. So showing that most of the brachiosaurids are fairly similar to each other in skull form. Now, so here we have living side by side. C, B, E, D, and A all lived in the same environment. Some of them are found in the same quarry. So that's Camarasaurus, Brachiosaurus, Barosaurus, Diplodocus, and Apatosaurus, respectively. And in part, the different neck lengths and perhaps the different ways of dealing with both the plant in terms of contact of teeth on plant and of pushing trees over or rearing up may have allowed them to partition out the resources in their environment and live side by side. And consider, when we see E, D, and A, those are the dinosaurs with all 4 feet on the floor. If they reared up, that would add a bunch more meters to their height. Brachiosaurus, by the way, I should go back here. Brachiosaurus and Brachiosaurids in general, despite what you see in the first Jurassic Park movie, almost assuredly did not rear. And there's good mechanical reasons why they didn't. So I can use Cedarosaurus here as an example. In the case of Diplodocids, the forelimbs are really short compared to the hind limbs, and the center of mass is right over the hips. In these guys, the forelimbs are longer than the hind limbs. The center of mass is going to be somewhere around here. So even if they could get the muscles to push them up, which they probably could, when they come back down, that's going to be additional force pushing down on those slender limbs, and that's probably not going to do their joints any good, or indeed the strength of their muscles, or bone. So, no, these guys, the way they got higher was they were built uphill. Okay. By the way, pointing this out, we have a state dinosaur. Technically, all states have state dinosaurs, but they're a particular subgroup. But some states also have a specific non-avian state dinosaur, and ours is Astrodon. What you see up in the corner is the original specimen of Astrodon. But we have additional specimens of them. All of them are found, well, you go up, Route 1, you keep on going down, you turn right on Conti Road, you turn right into a light industrial park, that's where the specimens are from. It's now a park, a state park. It is either a brachiosaurid or slightly closer to later Macronarians than to brachiosaurids. So it's around that part of the tree. And that's a model of Astrodon that's on display at the Maryland Science Center in Baltimore and need for scale. So there are a few other groups of Macronarians I'm not dealing with. There's a group of extremely long-necked forms called Eusauropods and so forth. But there's an important one that we'll end our look at sauropods with, and these are the Titanosaurs. Titanosaurs are a strictly Cretaceous group, at least as far as we know. And in fact, are most common in the middle to late Cretaceous. They're the last successful group of sauropods, but they're a very successful group. At present, about half the named species of sauropod are Titanosaur. It's just the vast majority of them are only incompletely known. Some of the things that make Titanosaurs Titanosaurs. Well, we can see here that they got very wide bodies. So here's a look at the back of a Diplodocid and a Titanosaur. And we see how wide the hip region is. The sacrals are really stretched out, and then the ilia themselves are sort of flipped over. So the body's really wide. That's reflected in their trackways. The trackways of Titanosaurs tend to have a wider gauge than most dinosaurs. Also, unlike their brachiosaurid cousins that had those long, slender front legs, the front legs in Titanosaurs, especially the forearms in Titanosaurs, the radius and the ulna, are quite robust. Oh, I should point out, in order to accommodate this wide load, unlike most sauropods, whose femur basically shows a right angle between the head, where it articulates with the acetabulum, and the shaft, they're sort of canted off to the side to give their wide guts even more space. During the late Cretaceous, these are by far the dominant group in Gondwana, that is the southern continents, and in Europe. So at the same time, the hadrosaurs and the ceratopsids are super common in Western North America, and at least hadrosaurids in Asia and so forth. The Titanosaurs are super common in South America, in Africa, in Australasia, and in Europe. Oh, and India. So here we see an Apatosaurus from a butt view, and a Rebbachisaurus, which is, as you can see, a much smaller Titanosaur. But look, the Rebbachisaurus is wider than this much larger Diplodocid. So if you scaled it up to the same body size, it would be extremely wide compared to it. Now, as I said, this is a hugely diverse group, but within that there are some subgroups, and as I talk about in detail in the lecture notes, no one agrees on Titanosaur phylogenetic relationships. It is the messiest part of the dinosaur family tree right now. That said, there does seem to be a subgroup that has some interesting adaptations, and one of those adaptations is they got no fingers. They have either greatly reduced or lost the phalanges on the mantis. So they're walking around, they're not knuckle walking, they're not walking on their metacarpals. And that's just freaking weird. But, nature is what nature is. Also, these forms tend to shift from, the stouter, spoon-shaped teeth, like these guys have, to teeth that look for all the world like Diplodocoid teeth, those pencil-shaped teeth. And in fact, there was a time when people used to think these were the better-known Titanosaurs. that Titanosaurs were a type of Diplodocoid. But subsequently looking at the skeleton and discovering earlier forms showed, no, that's just convergence. Here's one of the better skulls, sort of a mid-grade one. It's spinning around. So lots of diversity in them. There were some small-bodied Titanosaurs. So Bonitosaur here, you can see relatively small-bodied. Matsakalisaurus up there, sort of mid-sized. Ringosaurus over there, sort of mid-sized. Mendozasaurus, we can see quite large. There was actually a dwarf Titanosaur from Europe that's even smaller than Bonitosaur. But some of the Titanosaurs really earned that Titan in the name. It's a subgroup called the Colossosauria, and then there are some other groups within Titanosaurs that independently get giant size. So here we see, a model of Argentinosaurus, a cast of its limb bones, its forelimbs, and its vertebra, where its vertebra would be. And look, at the person standing there, if they jumped up, they might be able to touch the belly. Here is a single, either posterior, cervical, or anterior most dorsal of Puertosaurus with Fernando Novas for scale. So that's a gigantic, so you can see how thick the neck would be there. Here's a 2-meter scale for Futulongosaurus. And here we see someone on top of the ilium of Futulongosaurus. Recently discovered is Dreadnoughtus. You can see a sense of how big that animal is. It wasn't fully grown, the main specimen of it. And here's Ken Lacavara with the specimen of Dreadnoughtus in the field. And we could see, that as big as Dreadnoughtus was, it's in the middle there. We could see that things like Argentinosaurus above it and Puertosaurus, that's the one that Fernando was in front of. Actually, it was central cervical. Sorry about that. No, he was looking at that dorsal. So he was looking at that dorsal there, yeah. That these are even bigger than that Dreadnoughtus we saw. And yes, as I said, these things have the awesome ability to knock people on their side, to compare their side to it. So Patagotitan, this truly gigantic one. Futulongosaurus, another giant one. What is the largest dinosaur? Well, almost certainly a Titanosaur, except maybe that giant Dicraeosaurid or maybe a specimen of Barosaurus. But most of the giants are Colossosaurians or related to Colossosaurians. When we get the really super giants, we don't typically have big specimens. And consequently, it's really hard to say which one is absolutely the largest. That said, the one with the best evidence for being the largest is Argentinosaurus, who, as you can tell from its name, is from Switzerland, from Argentina, and is probably, depending upon the way you estimate mass, as heavy as a fin whale, the second largest living animal, something in the 80 to 95 metric ton range. Or another way of thinking about it, the size of a herd of elephants. But again, these large ones are not known from as complete specimens. Patagotitan is the biggest dinosaur for which we have relatively complete skeletons, but is smaller where we have overlapping bones than the biggest specimens of Argentinosaurus. Now, these giant titanosaurs dwarfed the largest meat-eaters in their time. And that's a pattern we see throughout the history of sauropods. They're always bigger than the biggest meat-eaters. So Alamosaurus, we see here, is a titanosaur from the late part of the Cretaceous of North America. It overlapped in time and place with Tyrannosaurus, so you see the biggest Tyrannosaurus there. And that Alamosaurus was a freaking huge animal. Now, to wrap things up with titanosaurs, some titanosaurs apparently evolved osteoderms. So we have osteoderms. They don't look quite like the osteoderms of an Ankylosaurus or another Thyreophora. They're not as solid on the outside. They're very spongy looking. So they're armored in a sense. They have bone in the skin, but it doesn't look like they have lots of bone in that skin. It wasn't really an armor shield. And one thought is it might reinforce the body and help keep it a little more rigid to walk along. Another thought is maybe it's a store for calcium and phosphate. And certainly it can be drawn upon for that so that the body can use it for its physiology, for producing eggs and so forth. But we still don't quite know exactly what these armor plates were for. So here is one pebbly version of Saltosaurus, as shown here. Okay, so that wraps up our look at Sauropoda. Here we see sort of an overview of the history of sauropods, sauropods from their beginning to their end. So we see prosauropods at the beginning, broad crowns, so that it's spatulate teeth later on, and then Dicraeosaurids, Diplodocids common in the middle, brachiosaurids joining them, Rebbachisaurids joining them, but later on, it's down to just Titanosaurs. Titanosaurs are the group that make it all the way to the end. All right, so that's our end of looking at plant-eating dinosaur groups, although not plant-eating dinosaurs. And starting on Wednesday, we pick up with the best dinosaurs of all, the meat-eaters, and the course culminates this Friday. So after Friday, it's all downhill here. It's all downhill. And that's because this Friday, we get tyrannosaurs.